Hi everyone, welcome to another daily sanity preserver. Today I'm super thrilled to have Jake Harper here. Jake is a designer and an artist. I'll share more background on his bio in the chat. Why I'm super excited about having him here today is because he's going to talk about a way in which we can freak the data and expand our filter with which we filter data to make better sense. And I think, probably before COVID-19 hit, I think problems of algorithmic bias and kind of like it's like self-fulfilling prophecies and the ways in which data is skewed, used, and abused had been like I think on the forefront of people's minds, really, especially in the wake of the upcoming elections. But now with COVID-19 happening, this is not a problem that is going away. No, quite the contrary. I think making sense of data and making better sense of data to kind of like improve our collective sense making is really an issue that I think will be relevant whatever crisis we'll face in the future, or also whatever kind of progress we want to make in the future. So I think having better ways in which we can process data more effectively and like let's say more holistically, really, I think is a really promising path, no matter kind of like what problems we'll face. So Jake wrote a really fantastic Medium post on this, which I'm going to share here. I think this topic is going to lead to quite a few new novel revelations in ways in which we can perceive different data fields. So it's not really so much focused just on computers alone. And yeah, I'm super thrilled to have Jake here. And I can't wait to kind of like to have our mind blown in all the ways in which we can better sense make. So with that being said, Jake, thank you so much for joining. I can't wait for your talk, and I'm going to post much more info about your bio in the chat.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Allison. And yeah, super excited to be talking to this group specifically. I think this is certainly a very new project for me to be thinking about, and I find that the Foresight Institute is often a great place to come when you have something that is super fresh and you want to kind of throw it at really smart people and get their feedback and insight. So yeah, really excited for your, in some cases, hopefully brutal feedback and discussion afterwards. So yeah, with that said, I'm gonna just share my screen and jump into it. Let's see here. Okay. So there's only a few slides and then I'll kind of open it back up to talk. But yeah, so just a quick bio about myself. So most of my career has been in the arts, focused mainly on auditory methods of control and mass notifications. So give an example of what that means. Here's an image from an opera that I worked on a number of years back that had its premiere at the Tate Modern. The opera was actually distributed by mass SMS messages. So these are like 5-digit codes that you use often for like getting reached out to by political campaigns, seeking contributions, things like that. And each of these messages contained a text link, an audio file, and all the audio files were sirens. And so audience received 45 texts over 2 hours. And this had created some interesting dynamics. For one, anyone that pulled out a phone throughout the museum, you could kind of possibly mistake them as a fellow member of the opera ensemble. So it kind of played with in-group, out-group psychology, but also the impact of distributed disruption of sirens popping off all throughout the gallery. So, that's one example of some of these kinds of pieces. Then, kind of in the middle of doing these kinds of activities, I took a nearly 4-year detour as a Zen Buddhist priest and monk. First at Tate Monastery in Nagoya. So I did a little over a year in training there, and then spent the remainder of the time as a working priest in Shosenji, which is a temple located in Tokyo, which was the temple that sponsored my training. Coming back to the US, very much interested in kind of applying some of the lessons that I was learning in museums and kind of applying them to broader challenges. So particularly like how humans and information interact. So the first project in this vein, which this is a kind of a still from, is around trying to improve the efficacy of humanitarian aid delivery. Often this is kind of like not only like an information and access problem, but also like a social stigma problem. And so this particular project was with the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, and we tried to apply military grade speakers and kind of like specially designed audio, developed jointly with a neuroscientist researcher named Luke Arnold, who's an expert on how humans process screaming, to kind of create this sound that we called an anti-siren, that would kind of boost the number of people coming to these mobile medical clinics in rural Malawi to receive care. So that was kind of like an initial project that kicked off a much bigger, I can say, like range of focus for me, that leads to some of the work that I'm doing now. So for the past 3 years, I've been leading both the external vehicle experience design team, as well as the sound experience design teams at a self-driving car company called Zoox. And the focus on this work is basically around social robotics and autonomous cars. And you can think of this as kind of like intersection between design, machine learning, and complexity sciences. So, like a roadway with, using San Francisco as an example, Market Street, there's a lot of kind of like, you can call it entropic pedestrian behavior. How can you use simple communication to reduce entropy, which makes roadways not only more efficient to drive on, but also safer and kind of creates more intuitive interactions for everyone. So this is kind of what we've been working on. Some of our solutions are already on operational on our fleet in San Francisco. And yeah, so that's kind of like the arc of my work over the last 10 years. So diving into the talk, first of all, yeah, super excited for people's questions. Feel free to comment, and looking forward to digging into them as we go. And yeah, I'm sure there's some people here who are better domain or more domain experts than I am on some of the things I'll be talking about. So really excited to get some of your feedback. I'm basically going to be framing up a really thorny problem, describing some alternative paths through the thicket, and then hopefully opening it up for discussion. So with that said, a little history. This is something that I'm sure is not new to most of you, but the earliest computers were basically like military supercalculators. So, they're based on punch cards and not really available to the general public, and you kind of had to be a specialist in order to operate one. This all changed largely due to the innovation of the graphical user interface, which opened the floodgates to personal computing in the 70s, starting with Douglas Engelbart, the mother of all demos at the Stanford Research Institute, through Xerox PARC, and then Apple, and on and on, leads us to where we are now, which is very much in the era of artificial intelligence, machine learning. Depending on what you read, quantum computers are kind of here, will be here soon. But certainly in the last 50 years, the amount and complexity of information in the world has grown by many orders of magnitude. But interestingly, our interaction model with data pretty much hasn't changed. Like we're kind of using a lot of the same concepts of the graphic user interface intact as they were from 50 years ago. What does this mean? Basically, graphical user interfaces, to me, have reached the bandwidth limitation to be useful. It's been described euphemistically as trying to drink from the ocean with a straw. So there's a cost associated with this bandwidth limitation. So to describe it, I think in a number of previous Foresight Institute talks, we've heard about accountability with algorithms, specifically algorithms that are already deployed in society for everything from how we distribute healthcare resources to criminal justice. Accountability is really difficult because these are basically black box data models. So for a casual non-scientist to engage with this, it's kind of like a wait and see approach, and then you see what the algorithm does, and then you crudely describe its results. And we've slowly been learning that many of these algorithms, maybe surprisingly or not surprisingly, contain latent racial biases. Biases of all kinds, but especially racial biases. So, that's one of the costs that we're starting to see with kind of our inability to kind of think and act in the heart of these more complex data models. But even fundamental computing tasks, so something like searching and synthesizing information, which is really one of the kind of like the core use cases of what a computer personal computer is meant to do. Even that is becoming increasingly strained. So this is something we're all used to seeing. This is an article about COVID-19. So it says the FDA chief raises the possibility that plasma from recovered coronavirus patients might protect the healthy. Great. This is really awesome information to read. Except, the challenge here is that basically high dimensional data, which this article is attempting to relay, is forced into a linear news report. So something that's high dimensional is now linear and hierarchically arranged. On top of that, the information itself, as we're tracking this particular topic, for example, is frequently changing, in some cases contradictory to itself. And the result is something that's nearly impossible to assimilate. And that's because, as we said, the information is basically presented like this. It's linear, hierarchical. And this is not something that we're seeing just with news articles, except that, in the midst of the pandemic, this is something that we're kind of interacting with a lot. But you can think of anything, like whether it's a Google search or how you interact with a spreadsheet or folder. This is kind of like the graphical user interface model is to organize information this way, roughly speaking. So, obviously, like being high dimensional data, it probably really looks something more like this in its original source. It looks like a rhizome, to use the Mill Plateau terminology. And so what's interesting about this is, like the information doesn't really have a center or a point of origin or like a natural line through the data. And so the people who are creating these natural lines or who are placing it into a hierarchical linear context are actually exerting a lot of influence on the information itself. It's kind of getting squashed. So working on, this is kind of like a data visualization challenge, right? Like imagine if we saw the news not as an article, but if we were kind of like taken to a page where we're constantly updated with the latest data visualization around cures or preventative care measures, things like that. So there are people working on this, data viz and machine learning. There's some really interesting research, for example, coming out of Georgia Tech, MIT, to name two. But the outcomes are severely limited by the fact that everything is still being designed for representation in a graphical user interface. And the trade-offs are pretty severe. It's something that you see constantly across the literature, at least the literature that I've had the chance to see. So there are people working on the interface itself. And in my mind, these are organized loosely along two poles. So you have, I think of it as like the sensorial external world. So this is things like virtual reality and augmented reality. And then you have people who are working on the interface challenge with respect to like an interior neurological space. And so these are things like companies like Neuralink and brain-machine interfaces. A lot of these proposed solutions require surgical implants. But something that's kind of central to all of these approaches is this hypothesis that more is more. So starting with VR, the basic premise is like, okay, there's a bandwidth limitation in a two-dimensional graphical user interface. Let's expand it to 3 dimensions. But as you can see, I mean, looking at how this person's interacting with, in this case, it's the Microsoft HoloLens. The interaction model is actually almost directly inherited from the two-dimensional graphical user interface. It's just expanded into 3 dimensions. It's really more like a compounding of the problem rather than alleviating it. So this isn't alone necessarily going to solve the problem. Related to brain-machine interfaces, definitely like the most kind of ambitious of the group. Something I find interesting here is looking at the problem of, so like, or like the core of the problem is like, okay, I have a thought in my head and I want to transmit this thought to your head. In order to do that, I have to introduce a lot of lossy compression because of this really archaic 50,000 plus year old technology called language, which is like our technology for transmitting thoughts from one brain to another. And so the thinking is with a surgical implant that can kind of directly transmit that information, it reduces the amount of compression, therefore there's more information being transmitted. So again, more is more. So, and that alone isn't necessarily like, a bad approach. It's just a little bit myopic. And it's kind of typical of a lot of moonshot tech projects that you see. I think self-driving cars historically is another of these where it's kind of like the thinking that like any problem can be solved by just having enough data, except that this kind of ignores the fact that like the brain kind of works in the exact opposite way. It tries to use as little data as possible to solve problems. And you can think of the progression of going from childhood to adulthood as basically the brain trying to figure out like how little data can I actually use to still survive. There's a lot of interesting work by the neuroscientist Robin Carhart-Harris actually on the default mode network of the brain, which is kind of like the regulator of information coming in. It's worth checking that out if you're interested in kind of digging more into that metaphor. But so yeah, basically, like this idea of more is not necessarily the only approach. So I think it's kind of worth looking outside of the world of technology to see some other examples of high bandwidth user interfaces that look nothing like the graphical user interface, and more importantly, don't require surgery. And so the two examples that I wanted to take you through kind of map to this interior-exterior dichotomy that we see with VR and brain-machine interfaces. The first example comes from a rainforest in the Ivory Coast, so this is the exterior example. And the second example is to look at the design language of the human body, specifically a body that's feeling a little bit of indigestion. So we'll talk about that when we get there. But so to kind of frame the next phase of the talk, it's important for me to introduce you guys to two main characters that we're gonna kind of take with us through to the end. So here are two main characters. On the left is a biologist named Klaus Zuberbuehler. He's a biologist at the University of St. Andrews, and he's an expert on cross-species communication. On the right, we have a leopard. And basically the leopard on the right is trying to catch and eat Klaus on the left. So the question is, how does Klaus survive his near-death experience with this leopard? The answer we'll find is because the rainforest has a really great user interface. Okay, so to frame this scenario, what's happening, this is actually based on a true story. We're gonna kind of diverge from the truth a little bit later on, but this is based on a scenario that Klaus has relayed in multiple interviews since it happened. So in 2010, he was conducting research on cross-species communication and spent the day in the Thai National Forest in Ivory Coast playing recordings of dyna monkeys playing their alarm calls to other species such as yellow-casqued hornbills. So part of the findings from the research, which is really fascinating, and I recommend you guys check it out, is that the species with a shared predator react to each other's alarm calls as if they're reacting to the predator itself. So for example, the dyna monkeys and the yellow-casqued hornbills have a shared predator in common. It's a horned eagle. So when the monkey says the word for horned eagle, the yellow-casqued hornbill reacts as if it heard the eagle itself, which is pretty fascinating. Also not surprising. So he's conducting this research. He had a bunch of speakers, and he was playing, the sounds of monkey alarm calls around the rainforest. It started to get late, and he packed up. He was hiking back to camp, and he didn't have a rifle with him. Starting to get a little nervous because it was getting dark. And what does he hear above him in the canopy? He starts to hear a dyna monkey making the alarm call for a sound that he recognizes for a leopard. Okay. In and of itself, not so bad. He keeps walking. 20 minutes go by. A different group of dyna monkeys above him in the canopy also make the alarm call for leopard. Okay, so there's a leopard nearby. He keeps walking, and a third group make the same alarm call for leopard. So now his adrenaline is spiking because he's learning not only is there a leopard nearby, it's also stalking him through the underbrush of the rainforest. Cool. So enter our third character in this little rainforest drama. So what's fascinating about this is, Klaus never actually saw the leopard with his own eyes. It was entirely through the eyes of the dyna monkeys because he understood their alarm calls. It was as if he was augmented by their eyes. So suddenly he's able to see the rainforest through multiple perspectives. Through, he's navigating himself. He's trying to avoid roots. He's stepping over the underbrush. But also, quite literally, he has eyes in the canopy that are leaping from tree to tree, tracking a dangerous predator that's trying to attack him. Interestingly, it's been hypothesized that this behavior of the dyna monkeys is called perception advertisement. Like they're being really conspicuous to the leopard. They want the leopard to know that it's been spotted. They also think that the leopard is the primary audience of the behavior. So the leopard also understands the monkey's word for itself. And basically, like the leopard's main hunting tactic is stealth and concealment. So having been outed by the monkeys, it knows that its chances of successful attack have dropped precipitously. And what happened is basically it abandoned its prey. This is kind of how Klaus survived. It's kind of amazing, like this public service announcement this public service that the monkeys are providing for other species in the ecosystem. And it's one that they receive in return as well from other animals. Okay, so how is this a user interface is a real question. At a higher level, just kind of like talking about an interface you know, like what is an interface? You can think of a user interface as being a site of exchange between two things. So it translates a medium being exchanged from one currency to another. For example, bits to graphics, kinematics to electrical signals, you know, from euro to dollar. But through the translation, it wields influence. So it's these two key points. One is it's a site of exchange, but the second is that by being the site of exchange, it wields influence on the other two actors in the network. And at the heart of what a user interface is, like the one that saved Klaus, is a really simple concept. Basically, user interfaces are filters. So rainforests are laden with high bandwidth information filters. So as we know, like from complexity sciences generally, the more diversity there is in an ecosystem, the more diversity there is also in like the modes of communication in that ecosystem. And so in a rainforest, species that live in close proximity organize their communications into distinct, non-overlapping acoustic bands. So in other words, the information can be said to be multiplexed. This is really important because it makes each strand of information hyper accessible to any other member of the ecosystem. And this is partly the underlying mechanics of why it was so easy for Klaus to suddenly latch onto the sound that the dino monkeys were making. It's not that they were necessarily loud or they were close to him, but because information is multiplexed, any piece of that kind of pipe is easy to reach at any moment in time. So to kind of dig into this concept a little bit further, this is a 12-second spectrogram of the dawn chorus heard at a biological research station in La Selva, called La Selva in Costa Rica. You can see there's an enormous amount of, there's just a lot happening here. There's insects, birds, there's a few water features that you can see, but all of the strands of information kind of exist in their own nice little niches. Actually, when I first saw this, it reminded me of being in composition class in college, and you know, you would do score study, and when you see like you know, like orchestral music written out, something that, you know, my teachers would say often is like, you can kind of tell if something sounds good because graphically it looks really good on paper. Like the ideas look organized. There seems to be this kind of like inner logic, and you can totally see that here. Like there's just really nice blocks. They're all kind of in their own separate spaces. It's really easy to kind of understand where everything is. In an environment where this doesn't exist, like in an urban environment where there's no multiplexing of acoustic information, it's basically just blocks of noise, and it's really hard to separate mentally looking at a spectrogram what's going on. So that's an interesting kind of aspect of this, but this is what multiplexed acoustical information looks like. Okay, so let's go back to the forest. So basically, in this particular scenario, at first, the leopard is basically invisible on the dense and noisy floor of the Thai rainforest. And the dino monkeys' high-pitched vocal calls are basically able to kind of filter out the noise and cut through and drag the leopard into the light. It's kind of like the acoustic equivalent of a high-res image that like pops up in everyone's amygdala. And it's really efficient. Like the alarm call for the dino monkeys is really, really short. It's like, you know, a couple seconds, and suddenly everyone is able to map this concept that there's a leopard nearby. For the members of the ecosystem who recognize this call, they're almost immediately able to recalculate their existential risk, change their behavior, and simultaneously the leopard's hunting strategy is basically defeated. So this is basically like the role of a filter in a user interface in a rainforest, is to select concepts of high importance and raise their prominence. And so by combining that with multiplexing of information, you're able to enable countless concepts of utility and meaning to basically be like hyper accessible and ready at hand. I kind of like appropriating this kind of like Heideggerian terminology to this particular instance, because I think it's an interesting way of thinking about information as like how readily available is information in an environment that you're designing. The counterexample to this scenario, for example, is our phones. If you were to look at a phone screen, you know, there's maybe 24 icons on the phone. Some of the icons have a number attached to them, which says something about kind of like the buildup of information existing in another dimension that you can't currently access. But there's actually not a lot of dimensionality that's ready at hand in the actual like gaze of like the home screen of a phone. And these are limitations that kind of persisted at any level of design on like a smartphone. So information is not ready at hand to anywhere near the same degree as it is like in a natural environment that has information multiplexing. Okay, so let's move on from the rainforest. Now we're going to focus a little bit more on Klaus, but at this point he's gotten back to camp. We're moving from the kind of exterior environment of the rainforest to the interior body. So to do this, we're going to diverge from reality. I don't think that anything I'm about to say actually happened to Klaus, but it's okay. We can kind of use him for our purposes. So he's gone back to camp. He's cold. He's hungry. He just survived a near-death experience. So what does he do? He's grateful to be alive. He's going to eat a hot pocket, I think. Let's make him eat a hot pocket. So he heats it up. He puts it in his mouth, and pretty much immediately his body has something to say. And this is something that we've all experienced if you've ever eaten something that immediately gave you indigestion, or even like a little bit after gave you indigestion. You can almost immediately like assign a cause and effect to the feelings that you're having in your body. So he eats his hot pocket, and suddenly his abdomen tightens, and he farts. So what is he reading from this? Basically, his body is telling him this was a mistake. So how is this possible that he's able to kind of have this conversation with his body? So, as we all know, like hidden deep within our bodies are countless semi-autonomous systems from the microbiome to blood flow to our digestive system. So collectively, let's call this the biome. There's also kind of like the higher level self that plans, remembers, and organizes, call this the head, the frontal lobe, the cortex, the default mode network. But between these two systems, there's a mediator. And this mediator is a word that hasn't been used in maybe the last 50 years so much in outside of like kind of like our esoteric medical, like experimental medical, like medical experiments, but it's a word I like to resuscitate because I think it's useful. This mediator is called synesthesia. So you're probably familiar with a very similar sounding word that begins with an S called synesthesia. Actually, both of these words came out of the same time period of kind of like this really interesting moment in 18th and 19th century Europe when this kind of like experimental, medical, psychological, and literary experiments were all kind of like mixing and sharing ideas. And so synesthesia and synesthesia both came out of this kind of milieu. But synesthesia is, if you can't tell already, it's like one of my favorite words ever invented. And yeah, we can talk more about its history. It's really fascinating. But what does this word mean? So synesthesia is basically like the general consciousness of our body existing separately from our sense of self. The French symbolist poet Mallarmé thought of synesthesia as evidence of the existence of a soul. But it's used in a medical terminology to basically describe like, feelings associated with your body. So for example, the feelings associated with being cold include shivering, goosebumps, teeth chattering, muscle tension. These are all kind of common examples of synesthetic language. Without synesthesia, the signals of the biome would be way too chaotic for us to process and organize and act on. So basically, synesthesia is the filter that converts these signals, the signals of the biome, into a language that the frontal lobe can understand. And more importantly, it enables this symbiosis to exist. So that's why when you get indigestion, you're able to actually like react meaningfully and change your behavior. So now comparing synesthesia to the user interface of the rainforest, one remarkable difference between these two is both of them are high bandwidth user interfaces. One remarkable difference is the ambient level. So you can think of like, whereas rainforests are pretty much constantly roaring with information and it's quite loud in rainforest, the body is actually much, much quieter. So, the cortex has become so attuned to the synesthetic patterns that the signals of the body mostly escape conscious thought. So overt messaging is pretty much reserved for moments that require cooperation with the executive motor function. So for example, indigestion that nudged Klaus not to eat another hot pocket, and miraculously he complied. Something to think about, the next time you kind of like you overtly react to a signal from your body. It'd be interesting to think about, the cause and effect between that signal arising, you taking note of it, and how you change your behavior. Some common examples include somebody feeling muscle soreness and stretching. Indigestion is another common example. When you feel chilly and you go and put on a sweater, to try and actually parse, what are the subsystems involved in that signal arising and how you're reacting, and realizing that this really is a user interface that's enabling cooperation between these two systems. So synesthesia is really powerful because it dances really carefully on this edge between foreground and background. So, kind of coming to the end of the talk before I want to open it up to others, but kind of pull all this together, since the 70s, user interfaces have pretty much had the same goal, not just being a tool that computers should not just be a tool for crunching complex equations or being military supercalculators, but really being available to navigate complex structures of information and to map these to human thought, and ultimately, as Douglas Engelbart famously wrote, to augment human intellect. So I think, in a world with machine learning and artificial intelligence, there's actually a lot to gain from looking at these models of Hyman with information filtering in the rainforest and in the human biome. For example, you have self-organizing streams of multiplexed information. You have filters that increase the amount of hyper-accessible information. These are two attributes that we currently don't use at all in graphical and user-face design commonly. And the third, and I think this is the most important, is a profound power of ambience, which improves collaboration between our thinking, planning brain and semi-autonomous networks. Interesting example or corollary between like the indigestion example and other semi-autonomous networks that we often collaborate with. Think about the next time your phone nudges you to interact with a social media network, and think about how ambience could be used to kind of alter that relationship in really powerful and I think positive ways. So in closing, how can we augment people's ability to think and act multidimensionally in the heart of these complex models? Maybe it's not by necessarily making filters bigger per se. I mean, I think that's important. There's important work being done, and there's value to virtual reality and augmented reality as much as there's value to brain-machine interfaces. But along the way, there's a really important opportunity here of not just making the filters bigger, but also freaking the filters, let's say, of thinking of new ways to use filters and be better about how we're filtering information. So with that said, I'm gonna kind of close my screen and stop sharing. And yeah, would love to open it up.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. Wow. Okay, man. That was definitely a lot of new information to me. This is really cool. Okay. One question, just I think for maybe you could even share a link of the name of the animal behavior researcher who you were talking about, just so people can follow up. I had a request. That'd be great. And then we have David Grossov with a question that he posted in the chat. David, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead. And if anyone wants to go afterwards, just let me know in the chat.
Yep. Yeah, and happy to post research links. I can put it in here if we have time before the end, or also happy to send out an email to this group through Allison with a little bibliography of some of the stuff mentioned today, because yeah, it's really interesting stuff to check out. So I'm happy to share.
All right.
David,
so
you having trouble unmuting.
Okay, he's now unmuted.
Thank you. I just was wondering whether the term synesthesia is similar to the more modern term of somatic sensation.
I don't know. So I've seen them used in the same sentence, and certainly somatic sensation in the definition of what synesthesia means. And there might be some nuance around somatic sensation that I'm not thinking. There's certainly nuance around synesthesia that I'm kind of obliterating by appropriating it into this context. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right. They could probably be thought of as interchangeable.
And how do you think about pain, which is complicated because there's often this idea that there's this peripheral, we use the word pain for two things. One is a kind of peripheral awareness that there's damage and injury and abnormality somewhere. And then there's pain as a form of sort of central suffering. So the opioids decouple the two phenomena, where people are very aware that their foot is throbbing, but they don't care as much. And there isn't this emotional mobilization around dealing with that problem in the periphery or wherever the pain is?
I think that's a really interesting example because it illustrates that like a lot of these concepts, especially when you're using like biomorphic design as a example, that there are thresholds, and finding like breaking points in the thresholds are really important to understanding like also like how you attune towards a goal. Pain is an interesting one as well because, you know, kind of outside the context of like opioids, but just in a general sense, you know, we often think of medicine as being at the beginning when you are remedying pain, right? Like pain equals disease, and the remedy of this is like a way overgeneralization, but like some sort of pain equals there's something wrong, and then medicine begins by like alleviating that pain. But in some interesting ways too, if you can kind of expand the concept of like of medicine as kind of including like the pain, like the pain input is your body like signaling like that attention is needed, basically. Like we need your collaboration to treat something, whether that's like, you know, reduce activity or, you know, taking medication or you know, what have you. But so I think that there's a really interesting connection between pain and medicine generally. But you're right, there are like some interesting examples where the model kind of breaks down, and I think a lot of this is around like, you know, addiction and things like that.
Do you think that this kind of idea of ambient signals are held with like a sense of chronic pain as a background, or fever, which until it gets extreme, you're aware that you're not right and that you have to avoid doing certain things and you have less energy? Like your body is really mounting an inflammatory response.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't get out of hand, it's fine. It's like calling the police. You don't want all the police to show up at your house all freaked out, but
yeah,
you sometimes need the police to show up.
And that leads to an interesting question of like, where does this come from? Like, why does this feedback exist? And you know, that I think makes me think of you know, could like the synesthetic or the somatic language be kind of like an emergent property of the fact that this is like a kind of symbiotic biome, and so the body found that by kind of revealing certain things to other parts of the network, it like created a higher chance of survival or something like that. Okay. Sorry, but I believe I may have cut you off. Apologies for.
No, you did not cut me off. I just want to make sure there's room for other people to talk, and I see other chat things have happened, so I'll stand down.
All right. How about, thank you, David. How about we open up the floor to Josh next? Josh, I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi. When you were talking about the woods and the monkeys, and I was thinking about spirits that exist in the woods. And then ESP, like I can really think about a certain place. And then a sales for one of my products will come directly from that area. That's the type of communication. And then the brain to brain that you were talking about. I don't know if you understand the question.
When you experience ESP, can you describe a little bit more about like how you embody that experience, or what the indicators are to you that that's occurring?
Yeah, so I'm a wampum salesman, which is it's a bead from a seashell that American Indians have used for thousands of years. And I've been thinking a lot about California lately, and I just had a sale from California just yesterday. Sometimes I might really want to go to Canada, and this town I have to go through to get to Canada, a seal will come right out of there. This happens all year long for years and years. And I'm like, there's some sort of, I don't know. I just wonder about that.
That's interesting. Do you think like, could there, like what would be the, if you were to like activate the information in a way, is there enough of like a salience to the feeling that like if you were to attune yourself to it and somehow like that you could find yourself activating it? And by take activate to mean something broadly, but like, you know, I mean, imagine you start finding yourself thinking a lot about California, and not only do you expect to see a sale in California, but maybe I don't know, you take out an ad in California. I don't know exactly how you.
Yeah, I don't think I'd ask. Maybe I don't know. I don't know. I know that Stanford had Stanford Research Institute had The Army had a whole ES program for like 25 years, and they might even still do it for the soldiers. But it's something along that lines.
That's super cool.
Well, perhaps you could send us a link to the Stanford research project. I've
Sure.
never heard of it. Thank you. Okay, Leslie Seymour, next question. You posted a bunch in the chat.
Yeah, I might be going a little bit off the topics that you described. I'm thinking of a future communication from person to person using BMIs that could actually read concepts or visions from the brain. I think we are making some progress here in the past few years, and it could also project visual objects into the brain of the recipient person. So any kind of communication between the computer and the user that we have today could be implemented in the future in more than one way. So we could, for example, if I have an image, a picture in my brain, or a scene, a visual scene, it could be intercepted by an MRI, what Berkeley has been using in the past few years. It's just the MRI will be smaller and portable and better resolution. And then that image somehow is transferred pixel by pixel, and then it gets projected into the recipient's neocortex. Now, the other way of doing it is just mapping the image into a conceptual description. So things like, now I'm seeing a tiger jumping on a cat or something, and that sentence is encoded. Could be encoded in natural language, or it just could be encoded as a syntactical and semantical encoding of some facts. And again, it can, on the recipient side, it could be visualized, perhaps based on the preferences, the Pinterest profile of the recipient, so that he would see the same thing what I have, or just the concept itself could be planted into the recipient's brain, and then it's up to him how he actually visualizes it. And so there are.
So you're asking Jake, how is this progressing, or?
Yeah, that what is the. So there will be some progression that probably at some point we will be able to implement the first alternative sooner than the second one. And I would think that the pixel to pixel is more likely, or pixel to concepts, perhaps the second. And maybe the concept to concept is the most difficult, but I didn't think about it too much. So I did do some thinking about it, but I think if someone is talking to neuroscientists more often than I do, then could give me some insight. So language translation.
Jake, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. You know, I mean, it's something that I think about a lot, and you were kind of describing this, right? Like, we kind of have assumptions about when we transmit that a pixel, as we conceive of it, would arrive and be a pixel in somebody else's mind. In a similar way, like, you know, it's like this kind of age-old question, like, is blue to me the same as blue to you? And so currently, like for example, like Neuralink is one example. A lot of that translation is being explored using machine learning, right? So like there's kind of like this messy tangle of signals coming out of the brain, and then how that messy tangle correlates with things like different kinds of muscle movement, or you know, generally I think right now the scale of what they're looking at is around like motor control. But when you start to extend that to things that are like purely abstract, there's a really, one of my favorite words in the world. It's this German word that's like the most delicious word ever said, which I'll try to pronounce for you, which is Bewusstseinslagen, which basically translates to like postures of consciousness. And what this means is like that we build up in our brains mainly through the kind of attenuation of the default mode network through like life experience, a series of cognitive filters that kind of intuit our how we filter information, how we respond to things. So what would be really cool and interesting that Leslie, your scenario is making me think of is like being able to actually like weigh or like have a sensorial interpretation of somebody else's Bewusstseinslagen, somebody else's kind of like assemblage of filters that make up their ego, which, you know, by having somebody project directly the pixels that they see that represent two different images, and realizing how similar or different they are from the pixels that you ascribe to that same object description would be an interesting way of doing that. Oh, Jeremy, thank you for writing that word down there. That's exactly it.
More questions from the chat. Anyone who'd like to go next? I was wondering, kind of like following up on David's question, you know, have you thought about at all how like super stimuli may like influence kind of like how filters kind of like process stimuli and kind of like filter them on? Like, is that, you know, a problem for that? Like, do we need kind of like to adapt our filters, you know, to the types of data that they may receive? Yeah,
and I think this is something that, you know, it's certainly not my like own opinion, but something I've seen or I've heard people talk about, and I tend to agree with this, is that I think we'll find this kind of like emergent, like intermediary space of like kind of sensations that are totally new that will start to map patterns to. So like one of them being like, you know, medical patterns and things like that that are, it's kind of hard to talk about now because it's like it's kind of mysterious, right? Like it's like, you know, going back to this metaphor of the color, it's like discovering a new color or like a new somatic experience. It's hard to describe, but yeah, I think that there will be certainly some sort of like kind of like emergent intermediary space that we'll discover that will become useful for things like you know, people understanding the health of their bodies and things like that. It'd also be interesting too if there could be a feedback loop between, for example, somebody and their doctor. You know, like the doctor prescribing somebody a range of behaviors, and then you know, when somebody's not compliant with that, there's these more kind of like ambient ways of the doctor being able to have communication with their patients. So, yeah. What do you think, Allison?
Yeah, it would be really interesting. I think actually, hard to say really. I mean, I would expect that would need to change, but yeah, I think we're not prone to many of the influences. But I think you know, I was thinking of the Center for Humane Technology, you know, which is trying to do some work around it, and that actually got me thinking about you know, have you heard of the Earth Species Project by ASA?
No.
And that's kind of like somewhat a sideball, but like basically he's trying to translate different animal languages into human language. I think they've just started. I can actually share a link to it here. They've started using, I think, different algorithms. I mean, it's you know, it's a pretty ambitious goal, but one of the ideas was, well, if we are able to understand them better, you know, that would be a major freaking shift in terms of our ability to have empathy towards other species too. And he gave a fantastic presentation that on that at DWeb camp, and I was wondering, I don't know, it just reminded me in terms of like monkeys being or like different types of animals being able to read different like other animals cues. I thought that, you know, doing that more and more so with language would be really interesting to kind of like get more of that kind of like cross-directionality going, so that we can kind of like have a richer filtering via different animals.
Yeah, and I think like as the the example of this guy Klaus Superbuehler showed is that, I mean, it's available, and part of it is, at least in like natural ecosystems, it's around like having shared environments and considering, like, with the goal of increasing empathy towards other animals, like, it's kind of like meta ecosystem that we're all sharing is starting to necessitate this. So in a way, I find it interesting, like these it's kind of like parallels between, we see these things emerge in like micro ecosystems. In other words, like two different species of bird that live in the same forest. But it's interesting that humans are discovering the need and the methodology for applying this, like now that we see ourselves as sharing a rainforest with different primates, even though you're not like co-located, but like obviously these things are impacting each other.
Yeah, and of course, Kriyan pointed out that it was John C. Lilly who started this. Yes, Kriyan, that's correct. So let's see. I think let's see how much progress we can make there. But maybe like you just at the end of it said, okay, what are new, more creative ways to kind of like freak the data more, or like really like freak the filter? What are kind of like I guess like upcoming projects that you'd like to do in that realm? Like what are kind of like interesting experiments that you'd love to see?
Yeah, I think, frankly, like, first and foremost is to we need like a new operating system or some sort of, just a way of organizing data that has machine learning kind of like built into the interaction model, rather than seen as like a sleeve that's applied on top. And that's actually like relatively easy, like to achieve something like that. I mean, like the kind of like raw pieces are all existing on the shelf from the sea of work that's happening among like data viz people and machine learning engineers, and to some extent with like hardware peripherals being available as well. So yeah, I think that'd be kind of interesting to like develop like some sort of basically what should be the next operating system? Like, okay, let's put graphical user interfaces on the shelf and rethink this model from the ground up.
Neat. Okay, we have Christy Dudley with another question.
I unmuted myself right away. Excellent. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about some problems that I've had with medical diagnostics, and just even as a consumer of medicine, continuously asking myself, is this normal? Is this healthy? And not really having good communication with my physician or other diagnosing medical person. And it seems to me that a lot of these ideas might translate really well for medical diagnostics or other instances where you're looking at sensory, different ways of thinking about sensory input.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's well documented. For example, like the general like user interface, kind of like I mean, a hospital is filled with dings and bings and there's really poor kind of like organization of information in hospitals with medical devices, and yeah, it's certainly like kind of like thinking about like the low-hanging fruit. Certainly like medical diagnostic applications would be like you could probably do a lot of damage like very quickly by just kind of like rethinking some of the way that messages are propagated, and by applying some of these concepts, right, of like taking advantage of ambient space more and trying to multiplex information a little bit better. One of the biggest challenges with medical diagnostic tools is that they're all made by different manufacturers. So it's like creating a common protocol that allows the information to be usable means that there has to be kind of established patterns. So there would probably need to be like a trade association or something like that that could kind of organize this from like a centralized way, or it's just like some really successful medical device that uses like user interface design as one of its selling features that then like kind of creates a standard by influencing the culture.
All right, neat. I think we are about to close. I just like very quickly, do you know about David Eagleman's new sensory vest by any chance?
No.
So it's basically translating different types of signals into a vest by which you can feel them. So like for a while they had on their website something like you can feel the stock market like rising and falling. And you know, that may not be a very nice thing to have right now, like strapped to your chest. But I think, you know, in terms of I think different ways, like it was usually meant for folks who have a few senses impaired and who can then use that vest to kind of like make up for it. So I think that would be an interesting kind of like filter to look at. I think you can try them out. They're really, really interesting. And like I like one thing that is a little bit more crude than that is what's it called again? Subpack. I don't know if you've tried that, but it's you've tried that. It's not really a filter, but I think it definitely kind of like wakes you up to like different ways in which you can kind of like at least increase your range. So I thought that was also an interesting point, maybe.
That's super cool.
Okay.
Allison, thank you so much for hosting. It was really awesome to talk to all of you guys, and thank you so much for your insights. And yeah, I really appreciated learning from all of your questions. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. This really blew my mind. It's definitely a lot of new topics touched and scratched, and I think a lot of people want to follow up now. So thank you so much. If you want to send me any links, I'll put them in the show notes on the Sanity schedule, and I will publish the video soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Bye bye.